Lord, how many are my enemies? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, Lord. Deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people. This year, there's been so much to hold. This week has been even deeper. And I myself have been overwhelmed with anger and sadness the whole week. Not just, it hasn't resolved for me. It didn't go away magically because a certain news agency said something. The psalm that I just read, I read it because it's human. I understand the Psalms as prayers of humans to God. This one specifically says a Psalm of David, something about Absalom, right? Anyways, we can go into genealogy or something, but it's a Psalm of David. It's a story. It's a prayer that he offers. But like humans, it's hard to say this, but humans love to have enemies, right? I was going to say we love enemies, but it's more that we love to have enemies. Does that make sense? It's just a human thing. We just love having human enemies, and and we just love to have God on our side against the enemy. Does that make sense? That's a rhetoric we've heard a lot of for a long time. I posted my psalm, my prayer that I wrote after voting on Tuesday. I posted on my Facebook page, and it was fascinating seeing both people who would claim Biden as an enemy and people who would claim Trump as an enemy, both appreciating my prayer. I mean, think about how much we love enemies, right? Did anybody else watch wrestling in the 1980s, right? The WWF, and you had Hulk Hogan, yeah, there you go, versus the Iron Sheik, and they literally would craft enemies for the sport. And even our sporting teams allow us to have enemies. I grew up in Cleveland in the 1980s. I really still don't like the Denver Broncos. I just can't get behind them, And the reality that we face right now today, the country that we live in, is half of the country voted for Trump and half of it voted for Biden, right? 51-48. It's not some huge majority we're in either side, right? It's this election was so much, I think all of us would say, but for me, it's bringing up this inner work that I've touched on lately, that it makes me realize how deep racism goes in our country. For me, there was a certain blatantness about Donald Trump's racism that made it hard for me to support him at all. And that made me sort of categorize people who would support him. And there's sort of a realization for me, but the half of the people of our countries are okay with that. And so there's something deeper going on. Racism isn't Black people's problem to fix, right? It's our problem to fix because we brought it. It's a really useful tool for the things that our empire has wanted to achieve. Hatred and division isn't a thing that Trump can fix. It's the way he works. It's the way he operates. It's a tool that he uses very well. But we've allowed it to be used, all of us, on both sides. Our country has become so divided and disconnected, and in some ways we choose that because it's easier, because we love to have an enemy and we love to think that God is on our side. But we could choose empathy for those who we don't like, who we don't agree with. We could also do that. but it's hard. It's hard to really get that we're all in this together. It's hard because winning is what we want. It's programmed in us. It's our system that we want more, better, faster, deeper. We end up in this place where we are divided and we are battling against our sisters and brothers with different worldviews. But I ask to consider the words of Paul today, who reminds us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Our struggle is against the rulers, against the authorities, and against the powers of this dark world. Paul might have written that while he was locked up in a Roman prison. It's something for us to remember. And does he mean the rulers like the president and the governor, or does he mean the rulers like the dark forces that empower us, that call us to have enemies, right? Right? Some of us want to linger on Trump as an enemy and celebrate his loss. The number one played song. Does anybody know what the number one played song is in the last 24 hours? Party in the USA by Miley Cyrus. And so it's people are just out partying in the streets. And I pulled up that YouTube video this morning, and it was like all the comments there. Anybody else here to celebrate Trump losing? Anybody else here to celebrate Biden and Harris winning? It's just a party in the USA, and I think there's something beautiful to celebrate, that an additional 3% of the nation decided that decency and character matters. That's good. But there's a deeper reality that something else is going on, that 48% of the country is ready to allow people of color and immigrants and others to suffer. Right? I have to deal with both sides of this. And this is the thing, right? The truth is that Trump is a rude person. He lied a lot. More than a normal politician. He lied a lot. But politicians lie. He made space for racism in our country and for anti-immigrant rhetoric. The Proud Boys and other insurgent groups are on the rise because they've had a certain safe haven in our country that hasn't been here for decades, for half a century. They haven't. I remember seeing the red hat that said "Make racists afraid again," and I thought, oh, that's good. That's good. There should be a certain fear. All right. I thought that was funny, but at some point, racists are people too. What's there? What's underlying? What are they? Right. We don't choose racism. We choose racism because it explains our situation. We choose a narrative for our lives because it explains the struggles that we face. And people who are struggling, they have a story to tell too. I mean, yeah. Are the actions of Trump condemnable? Yes. I have struggled with him constantly. But if I just make him an enemy, and I make all people who accepted his explanation of why things are hard an enemy. But yeah, when Nazis marched through Charlottesville and chanted anti-Semitic chants, and he wasn't willing to condemn that was horrible. But the reality is, the other side of the reality is, Biden's just another 70-year-old white dude with the same systemic and generational prejudices that he's trying to. He desires to unravel them, but yeah, we know that's going to be hard for him. Systemic racism is our country's foundational sin. It's how we earn money. It's how we. So I'm present to two things. I'm present to how the concept of enemies is just human, right? And I'm also present to how destructive the concept of enemies is, right? I mean, think about it. 95% of movies wouldn't have a storyline without an enemy, right? If there wasn't a villain in the movie, like most movies would fall flat, especially big box office movies. I think if you go into indie film, you might do a little better. But anyways, think of how Trump has created enemies, even in us, even in our own hearts. We have more enemies, even if we didn't agree with Trump, even if we have bought that line. Think about how Trump created enemies out of people of color, immigrants, women, LGBTQ people. But then think about how people who Hillary Clinton called deplorables were created enemies, right? We've bought into a system that says we need enemies. And that's the world system. That is the powers of this dark world that we are called to fight against. And yeah, I've been figuring out how to talk to you all and what to say in the midst of like me not knowing you all and this being a huge, crazy cluster mess. Yeah. And we're just getting to know each other. But this is kind of how I work. I just put it on the table and you guys figure out if we can work together or not. So I admit that I want an enemy, right? I want an enemy. And the Old Testament, if we live in that place, it sort of gives us it gives us permission to have an enemy. You know what I mean? Right? Psalm 3. But I feel like when Jesus comes, he sort of takes away that luxury, that comfort, that old dirty blanket or that old dirty chair that you just love so much, but it's just not quite good for you anymore. Like Jesus says, we're supposed to love our enemies and pray for them. It's almost like he's taking away that thing, right? It's like Jesus kind of calls us to something bigger than God, kill all my enemies. In the 12-step programs, when you kind of face an enemy, so to speak, you face a person that you just want to punch in the face, they ask you to pray for them. They ask you to, and not just pray for them like, hey, God, like, give this person a clue, or even the psalmist prayers of like, may horrible things befall my enemy. You're supposed to pray for things that you want for that person. Peace, grace, love, comfort. You're supposed to pray for that person, and hopefully it will change you. I think it was Andrew who was talking about how he's been following this sort of C.S. Lewis concept that prayer changes us. Anyways. So in this moment, we are suffering. I mean, we are celebrating and lamenting. We all are. And both of those things are coming. Whether we supported Trump and we are lamenting his loss because he spoke to us. He spoke to a truth that nobody else wants to acknowledge. Or whether we're celebrating that magically Joe Biden and has become president. Whether we're celebrating that or lamenting the loss, there's just this deep reality. Racism's still rampant, still part of our country. It's still ingrained. That's why I was present to Dr. King's words this morning. Like, it's not gone. There's kind of this, some historians talk about how we sort of reckon with it again and again. We stuff it in the closet and we go, hey, well, Joe Biden won, everything's good. And we don't actually wrestle with it. And the reality is people like us, people, middle-class white folk, haven't really experienced much pain from this. Many people of color have felt this pain because the racists aren't as afraid anymore. They don't feel like they have to hide their racism anymore or in the same way. So just because 3% more people voted for Joe Biden doesn't mean our racism problem's gone. And that's what I've been struggling with this week. James Baldwin, an African-American scholar and theologian and philosopher and all those things, he said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. As a person who grew up in a pretty broken household, my family of origin, and we still relate to each other, we're still in relationship, but they're just, my family just doesn't want to talk about it, you know? Why do you need to talk about it? Some stuff's just better left alone. But if we don't face it, it can't be changed. We can't change ourselves. We can't overcome the sins of our fathers and their fathers before them and mothers before them without looking at it and without digging deep. And it's hard. It's hard work. It's hard work. Yeah, it's hard work. Just ask my therapist and my spiritual director about how hard it is to face those demons. We doing the work of dissecting our white privilege, or recognizing the way that black and brown bodies have been commodified by our culture for decades and decades and decades, and it's not over just because we gave them the right to vote and they can use the same drinking fountains as us. I just think that having enemies is a luxury we just don't get to have. I'm not saying you can't celebrate. I'm not saying you're doing the wrong thing in celebrating that something happened. Something did happen. But it's not done. And an overt celebration may remove the opportunity for growth that we've been given. I think it's strange to hold this Psalm 3, as followers of Jesus, but I think it's part of that step of grieving, right? It's part of the step of processing all the human emotions. We still have what many people call our lizard brain back here. The fight or flight thing is still part of how we're wired, and we can't ignore it. We can't ignore our feelings and emotions. And we can't ignore the celebration or relief that we feel, but I think we need to be present to something deeper going on. So while it's human to celebrate or lament, let us be very, very careful not to throw away any of God's children. Let us find a way to do the work to undo our beautiful country's original sin. Let us root out the white supremacy that lives in and around us. And let us seek God in all ways and in all people. Let us find freedom from enemies, the enemy that divides us by red and blue, by black and white and rich and poor. Let us seek to unite in God's goodness. Amen.